Oh, stumbling upon this hidden hall is no accident. Perhaps the 9 divines meant for you to be here. Follow me, sit beside the hearth, and take some rest. There's a long road ahead of you through the snow, so feel free to ease your mind and listen to my tales. Tonight I'll speak of a distant land far from these frozen peaks, of the ash-swept realm of Morrowind and its living gods. There was one among them who spoke little and hid himself away in a city of brass and gears, a wizard who reshaped the world to please his own eye. The Dunmer called him many names: the light of knowledge, the father of mysteries, the clockwork god. His name was Sotha Sil. Long before the Dunmer walked with ashen skin and burning red eyes, the elves of Morrowind called themselves the Chimera, and they lived in a land they knew as Resdain. This was the dawn of the First Era, a time when the great houses squabbled over land and salt and ancestor tombs, and when the Dwemer still hammered at their deep machines beneath the mountains. Among the many houses of the Chimera, there was a small and quiet one called House Sotha. It held little sway in the politics of Resdain. It could not muster the armies of a house like Redoran, nor command the wealth and slaves of a house like Dress. It was a minor name among mighty ones, a candle among bonfires, and few outside its own walls gave it much thought at all. The seat of House Sotha was a town called Old Sotha. It sat quiet and green in a corner of the land, tended by artisans and scholars rather than warlords. In the mornings, birds sang from the rooftops, and the smell of cooking drifted out from the kitchens, where cooks worked scrib jelly into sweet pastes and set them out to cool. There was a fish pond at the heart of the town, where the water lay still and dark, and koi moved slow beneath the surface. Around it grew flower gardens, tended by careful hands, their petals opening wide in the warm season. Potters sat at their wheels and shaped wet clay into bowls and urns, and the wheels hummed under their palms all through the day. Children ran between the buildings with jars in their hands, catching torch bugs at dusk and watching the little lights blink and drift behind the glass. Into this quiet place, a child was born, a Chimera boy of House Sotha, who would one day be called Sotha Sil. From his earliest years, those around him noticed that his mind ran differently from other children. He asked questions that his elders struggled to answer. He watched the potter's wheel spin and wanted to understand why the clay held its shape. He watched the torchbugs glow and wondered what made the light. Magic came to him early, and it came easily, the raw talent of it flickering at his fingertips before he had the words to name what he was doing. Even among a house of scholars and artisans, the boy stood apart, and the elders of House Sotha spoke among themselves of the strange gift that had been born under their roof. The boy was not alone in the world. He had an older sister named Sotha Sil, and he loved her dearly. She was older than him, and she watched over him in the way that older siblings often do, half guardian and half companion. Where the boy was quiet and inward, lost in his own thoughts, his sister drew him out of himself. They knew every corner of Old Sotha together, every hidden path between the garden walls, every place where the torchbugs gathered thickest at dusk. On rainy days, when the water ran down the eaves and the streets turned to soft mud, they would sit inside and eat scrib jelly spread thick on bread, watching the storm through the windows. Sotha Sil respected his sister above almost anyone, and in the small world of that town, the two of them were rarely far apart. There was a place near the edge of Old Sotha that the children were told to avoid, a boundary that the elders warned them not to cross. Whether it was the wildness of the land beyond or some older caution woven into the warnings, The meaning of it had faded into simple habit. Children are drawn to forbidden edges, and Sotha Sil and his sister were no different. On one rainy morning, with the water still dripping from the rooftops and the gardens heavy with damp, the two of them slipped away from the watchful eyes of the household and made for that forbidden edge, wanting only to see what lay beyond it. It was an ordinary morning in an ordinary life, the kind of morning that a child forgets by the time they grow old. Yet this morning would be the last of its kind that Sotha Sil would ever know. For while the two siblings wandered near the edge of their small green world, something had already turned its gaze toward old Sotha, something vast and burning and hungry for ruin. The quiet town with its fish pond and its flower gardens and its humming potter's wheels stood at the very end of its long peace, and none within its walls yet knew that the fire was already on its way. Rainwater collected in the clay tiles of the manor roof, dripping steadily into the gardens below. A massive hand of red flesh and black iron smashed through those tiles, sending sharp fragments cascading into the courtyard. Mehrunes Dagon stood over the town of Ald Sotha. The Daedric prince possessed 4 muscular arms, each wielding a massive, serrated weapon of dark metal. He drove a broadsword into the earth, and wide fissures opened in the soil. Magma seeped upward through the cracks, boiling the water in the fish pond and instantly turning the koi to white flakes of ash. Small horned scamps and heavy-armored Dremora poured through the breached walls, holding pitch-soaked torches and hooked blades. They set fire to the wooden bridges and slaughtered the town guards on the steps of the central square. Inside the sleeping chambers of the main house, thick grey smoke rolled under the wooden doors. The intense heat caused the painted murals on the walls to blister and peel in long, curling strips. Sotha Sil woke and coughed as the soot filled his lungs. His older sister, Sotha Sil, grabbed his wrist, hauling him out of his bed. They ran barefoot down the stone corridors, their feet slapping against the warm floorboards. Sparks drifted through the shattered windows, igniting the long silk tapestries hanging from the ceiling. The fabric curled and blackened, dropping flaming cinders onto the woven rugs. The heat pressed against their skin, forcing them to shield their faces with their free hands. In the central courtyard, the elders of House Sotha bled out on the cobblestones. Dremora soldiers drove jagged spears through their chests and kicked their bodies into the burning flower beds. Sotha Sil pulled her brother toward a narrow stone alcove built deep into the foundation of the manor. As she stepped forward to enter the gap, a heavy, burning roof beam crashed down from the ceiling. The massive timber pinned her to the ground, trapping her beneath the weight of the flaming wood. Embers showered over the stone floor. The flames consumed her clothes and her flesh, leaving Sotha Sil trapped in the alcove, watching the fire reduce his sister to charred bones. The heavy smell of burning hair and roasting meat filled the tight space. The Daedric prince marched directly through the center of the town. His massive cloven hooves shattered the remaining stone walls and crushed the paved roads. He swung his axes and maces, leveling the pottery kilns and shattering the garden terraces into dust. Sotha Sil remained completely still in his hiding place. The intense heat singed his hair and cracked the skin on his face, leaving red blisters across his cheeks. He watched the red giant dismantle every building, tearing the roofs off the artisan shops and throwing the masonry into the magma fissures. By sunrise, the Daedric forces returned to the rifts they came from. Every other member of House Sotha lay dead in the smouldering debris. Sotha Sil sat alone among the cooling coals and the grey dust. The rain returned, mixing with the soot to form a thick, dark paste over the ruins. A mortal warrior walked through the shattered outer gates. His name was Vivek, and he wore overlapping plates of bronze armor. Black soot coated his bare arms and his face. He carried a broad-bladed sword, stepping carefully over the burning timbers and the scattered bodies of the Kaima. Vivek heard the shifting of rocks and moved toward the ruined foundation of the main manor. He pulled the heavy stones aside and found Sotha Sil curled in the tight alcove. Vivek reached down and hauled the survivor out of the wreckage, setting him on his feet in the open air. Decades later, temple scribes dipped their quills into black ink and pressed them to parchment to record this specific meeting. One long scroll describes Vivek pulling a small, trembling boy from the ashes of his family home. Another leather-bound text, written in heavy script, claims Sotha Sil stood as an older youth, matching his rescuer in height as he stepped out of the rubble. Both sets of ink dry on the pages of history, presenting two conflicting physical images of the survivor in the ruins. The texts sit on wooden shelves, leaving the exact details of his age buried in the ashes of the town. Sotha Sil stood in the center of his destroyed home. He stared at the deep, cloven footprints left by the Daedric prince in the hardened mud. He committed the exact shape of the red giant, the 4 arms, and the smell of the sulfur to his memory, etching the image of Mehrunes Dagon into his mind. Vivek placed a gauntleted hand on Sotha Sil's shoulder and guided him away from the wreckage. They walked together along the dirt paths leading away from the smoking crater. Ahead of them, tall stone spires rose above the tree line. Robed figures carrying large scrolls and crystalline staffs moved between those spires, preparing their halls to take in the orphan and mold his raw magical talent. Sotha Sil arrived in the high-walled keeps of House Indoril, with ash on his boots and only the clothes on his back. The great families of the Kimmer took the orphan in, and he walked through halls built of polished obsidian and carved bone. He spent his days in the deep libraries of the keeps, pulling heavy scrolls from their iron racks. He ran his fingers over dried parchment and untied the thick leather bindings of ancient spell tomes. While other children swung wooden swords in the courtyards, Sotha Sil sat on cold stone benches, tracing intricate geometric shapes into the dirt with a pointed stick. He gathered magicka between his palms, forming spheres of blue light and shaping them into precise, crystalline structures. He altered the temperature of the air around him, freezing water in stone basins and then turning the ice to steam with a flick of his wrist. The older mages of the house watched him manipulate the fundamental forces of the world with a steady hand. They brought him heavier tomes, and soon they began coming to him with their own complex questions. Before long, he stood among the rulers of Resdain, wearing the fine-spun robes of a royal mage. He stood beside Indoril Nerevar, the great warlord of the Kaima. Nerevar wore heavy pauldrons of cured bugshell and carried a long, curved blade at his hip. He was a tall man with a scarred face, and he commanded the armies of the great houses with a deep, booming voice. Beside Nerevar stood his wife, Almalexia, draped in shimmering golden silks and wearing heavy emeralds that caught the light of the hearth fires. Sotha Sil took his place at their side, holding rolls of star charts and ink-stained maps. When the generals of the houses gathered around the heavy wooden tables, they spread out maps of the valleys and the mountains. Nerevar always looked to Sotha Sil before moving his carved wooden markers. Sotha Sil pointed a long, ink-stained finger at the mountain passes, detailing the flow of magical currents and the physical vulnerabilities in the terrain. The young orphan grew into a tall Chimer with long dark hair, holding a wooden staff topped with glowing stones. He became a teacher to those who wielded power across the land. He sat on woven mats under the shade of giant mushroom trees, surrounded by students. Farena Andrano sat across from him, watching his hands as he demonstrated the exact wrist movements required to weave a warding spell. She mirrored his gestures, and a shimmering barrier of violet light formed in the air between them. He corrected the angle of her fingers, ensuring the geometry of the spell held perfectly stable against the wind. Vivek also sat among his students. Vivek wore light leather armor and carried a spear, splitting his time between martial forms and the study of the arcane. Sotha Sil taught Vivek how to read the positions of the stars and how to channel raw magicka through the steel tip of a weapon. The three of them, Nerevar, Almalexia, and Vivek, relied heavily on the quiet mage's intellect. They brought him ancient artifacts pulled from the ash wastes, and he dismantled them piece by piece, laying the gears and enchanted stones out on his workbench to understand their internal mechanisms. Mages across the houses brought him their most complex formulas, laying the parchment on his desk and stepping back. Sotha Sil corrected their calculations with a few strokes of his quill, handing the pages back in total silence. He constructed complex models of the constellations out of wire and glass, rotating them by hand to predict the shifts in magical energy across the changing seasons. He developed original ways to bind elemental fire and frost, writing down the incantations in thick leather-bound journals that the other mages copied and distributed among the armies. The forces of Resdain gathered their strength in the courtyards and the open fields. Men and women sharpened their blades on wet grinding stones, and the smell of hot iron and burning wood filled the air. Nerevar stood on the battlements, looking out toward the jagged peaks of Red Mountain. Sotha Sil stood beside him, clutching his staff, watching the dust rise from the north. The Nords marched down from their frozen lands, wearing heavy bear furs and carrying great axes of forged steel. Their shouts carried across the rocky plains, and their boots crushed the sparse vegetation of the ashlands into the dirt. The Chimer lines formed ranks, their chitin armor clicking together as they raised their shields. Sotha Sil stepped to the front, raising his staff, and the air around him began to hum as he drew the magicka from the earth itself. The sky darkened with clouds of ash, and the Dwemer armies emerged from their subterranean cities to stand beside the Chimer, joining their mechanical constructs with the magical wards of Sotha Sil as the invaders charged the line. Heavy wooden longships struck the northern shores of Resdain, bringing men wrapped in thick bear furs and heavy iron helmets. The Nord invaders carried wide-bladed axes, marching across the ash plains and leaving deep boot prints in the grey dust. They swung their weapons through Chimer guards and smashed Dwemer machines into scattered gears. The ash grew thick with the smell of spilled blood and burning wood. Indaril Nerevar strapped on his golden armor and led his troops toward the steep slopes of Red Mountain. Beside him marched King Dumak, leading long lines of brass automatons that vented steam from their exhaust pipes into the cold mountain air. Sotha Sil stood on the rocky ridges above the marching columns, raising his bare hands toward the sky. He pulled bright arcs of lightning from the storm clouds, striking the Nord lines and splitting their iron shields into blackened splinters. Fire poured from his fingertips, turning the snow to boiling mud and charring the invaders' heavy cloaks. The Nords opened their mouths and unleashed raw shouts that cracked the stone underfoot, sending physical shockwaves through the air. Sotha Sil raised his palms, projecting shimmering barriers of purple light that caught the shockwaves and shattered them into harmless sparks. The air filled with the sharp smell of ozone and melting iron. The surviving Nords turned their backs and ran down the mountainside, dropping their axes in the ash as they fled toward their ships on the coast. Inside, a large pavilion made of stitched garskin, Nerevar and Dumak stood beside a long wooden table. Sotha Sil stood between them, holding a quill and unrolling a sheet of thick parchment. He wrote out the terms of a new border, the ink drying quickly in the dry heat of the tent. He pointed to the maps, tracing lines along the rivers and mountain passes with his index finger. Dumak reached across the table and locked his thick hand around Nerevar's wrist. The Khymer generals and Dwemer architects raised their cups of fermented flin, spilling drops onto the dirt floor. They hung the golden banners of House Indoril right next to the geometric metal standards of the Dwemer clans. Khymer lords approached Sotha Sil, pressing their foreheads to their hands in deep bows. They handed him ancient scrolls and tall staffs carved from dark ebony wood. They spoke his name in low, reverent tones, naming him the greatest sorcerer in the land. Khymer farmers returned to their fields, pushing spades into the volcanic soil and keeping their eyes entirely on the dirt as they pulled up thick roots. In the crowded market squares, Dwemer merchants exchanged brass pipes and glass lenses for Khymer spices and woven silks. Sotha Sil spent his days in quiet stone chambers, sitting at heavy oak workbenches. He held pieces of Dwemer scrap in his hands, turning the metal cogs under the candlelight. He tapped the brass casings with his fingernail, listening to the chime of the metal. He unrolled long Dwemer schematics, tracing the complex geometric lines and calculating the math behind the steam pressure and tonal resonance. He used fine iron tools to pry open the chassis of a broken mechanical spider, studying the internal soul gem brackets and the tiny copper wires running along its joints. He observed the physical methods the Dwemer used to bend the raw elements of the world into moving shapes. He ground specialized ink from crushed pearls and recorded his findings in large leather-bound journals. He memorized the exact angles and the precise measurements of their engineering, stacking his shelves with replicated brass gears of his own making. Far below Sotha Sil's quiet study, deep inside the volcanic rock of Red Mountain, rivers of orange magma flowed through massive caverns. The air grew thick with sulfur and extreme heat, melting the edges of standard iron tools. High-tonal architect Kagranak stood on a platform of suspended metal, looking down into a massive excavated crater. Inside the crater rested a colossal, petrified heart. It was the heart of Lorcan, a physical remnant of a dead creator god. Veins of blue energy pulsed across its surface. The sound of a slow, heavy heartbeat vibrated through the stone walls, shaking the dust from the cavern ceiling. Kagranak hammered away at his anvil, forging 3 specific items in the oppressive heat. He lifted a short blade named Keening, its edge humming with a high-pitched frequency. He set down a heavy hammer named Sunder, its head glowing with concentrated thermal energy. Finally, he shaped a thick metal gauntlet, named Wraithguard, lining the inside with protective enchantments. Dwemer workers hoisted giant sheets of brass and copper on heavy iron chains, building a mechanical body, piece by piece, above the pulsing organ. They bolted thick metal plates together to form legs as tall as watchtowers, and they connected large hollow tubes to the chest cavity. They hammered the rivets in total silence, sealing the massive stone doors. They kept the Khymer far away from the glow of the heart and the rhythmic thumping echoing through the deep stone. Deep within the crust of Red Mountain, far below the ash slopes and the basalt pillars, a massive cavern held a localized source of immense energy. This was the heart of Lorcan. It rested suspended in the center of a vast stone chamber, emitting a low, rhythmic thud that vibrated through the rock walls and the soles of boots. The outer layer of the heart glowed with a deep crimson light, illuminating the surrounding metal scaffolding in stark red and black shadows. Thick steam hissed from vents in the floor, carrying the smell of sulfur and heated copper. High tonal architect Kagranak stood on these metal platforms day after day. He wore heavy robes layered over brass plating, his hands stained with oil and metallic dust. Kagranak commanded the tonal engineers of the Dwemer, directing the construction of bronze resonators, steam-driven mechanisms, and massive acoustic tubes all around the divine relic. He drafted blueprints across wide stone tables, sketching the dimensions of a colossal brass construct known as Numidium. His schematics detailed an artificial god, a towering machine standing hundreds of feet tall, designed to channel the raw power of the heart into the Dwemer people, elevating them to a higher state of existence. The massive brass limbs hung suspended from heavy iron chains in the adjoining foundries, dripping with molten metal. To harness the heart, Kagranak forged 3 specific instruments at his roaring forge. He placed them on a velvet-lined workbench for his tonal architects to examine. The first was keening, a short blade forged from a crystalline material that emitted a constant, high-pitched hum, causing the air around it to ripple and distort. The second was sunder, a heavy hammer with a massive metallic head that crackled with blue static electricity, throwing bright sparks onto the stone floor with every movement. The third was Wraithguard, a thick, articulated gauntlet of heavy brass woven with complex enchantments, designed to shield the wearer from the destructive magical feedback of the other 2 tools. Kagranak calibrated these instruments daily, striking metal plates with sunder, carving into tuning forks with keening, and measuring the resulting sound waves. He kept the primary schematics locked inside a vault, guarded by heavy steam centurions, fully dedicated to completing his grand work. He calculated the exact tonal frequencies required to shape the divine energy into a usable form, poring over the mathematical formulas and geometric charts late into the night. Rumors of this massive undertaking seeped out of the mountain. Khmer scouts and traders caught glimpses of the blueprints and the towering brass limbs being assembled in the lower foundries. They saw the glow of the 3 tools through the open doors of the forge and heard the tonal vibrations echoing up the mine shafts. The scouts returned to the Khmer capital, carrying stolen parchment sketches, and placed their reports on the long wooden war table before Indaril Nerevar and his advisors. Sotha Sil unrolled the thick parchment documents. He traced the lines of the brass automaton and the precise specifications of the 3 tools with his finger. He calculated the vast amounts of energy the Dwemer intended to draw from the heart, analyzing the complex magical theory behind the tonal architecture. He recognized the geometric patterns as a method of reality manipulation, identifying the exact points in the diagrams where the tools would strike the divine flesh to release the energy. The Khmer generals slammed their fists onto the wooden table, their voices echoing off the stone walls as they demanded action against the Dwemer for tampering with forces beyond mortal control. Nerevar gripped the edge of the wooden table, his knuckles turning white against the polished grain. He ordered his guards to prepare a caravan and rode out to the shrine of Azura. The shrine sat on a high, wind-swept ridge, smelling of burning moon sugar and heavy incense. Nerevar knelt on the cold stone floor before the towering statue of the Daedric prince. He placed offerings of gold, silver, and rare gems at the altar and performed the summoning rites, chanting the ancient words. The smoke thickened, pooling along the floor, and the voice of Azura filled the chamber. She confirmed the reports from the scouts. She described the exact nature of the brass machine and the profane tools, detailing the disastrous consequences of the Dwemer tonal engineering. She instructed Nerevar to stop the Dwemer and prevent them from tampering with the divine essence. Nerevar returned to his council chamber, gathering Sotha Sil, Almalexia, and Vivek to his side. He relayed the command of Azura, detailing the exact words spoken in the smoke-filled shrine. Nerevar drew his longsword and drove the tip into the center of the map spread across the table, right over the symbol of Red Mountain. Chimer lords and generals mobilized their forces. Armorers sharpened swords on grinding stones, sending showers of sparks into the air, and tipped arrows with flint and steel. Foot soldiers strapped on heavy chitin armor, forming tight ranks in the dusty courtyards, while scrib-drawn wagons loaded with provisions lined the streets. The First Council fractured into hostile camps, the alliance broken. The armies of the Chimer began their long march toward the ash-covered slopes of the volcano. Ash crunched under the boots of the Chimer soldiers as they marched up the steep slopes of Red Mountain. Sotha Sil rode near the front of the column, alongside Indoril Nerevar, Almalexia, and Vivek. He wore the heavy armor of a general and carried a staff carved from bone. The soldiers around him kept their eyes on him, recognizing him as the greatest sorcerer in Nerevar's forces. Flakes of grey soot fell from the sky, coating their armor and settling into the folds of their cloaks. The air smelled of sulfur and burning rock. Steam hissed from vents in the jagged basalt beneath their feet. The Chimer army reached the massive bronze gates of the Dwemer stronghold. Sotha Sil raised his hands, and lightning arced from his fingertips, striking the metal doors. The bronze heated to a glowing red, and Chimer warriors battered the weakened metal with heavy rams until the gates buckled inward. The army poured into the tunnels. Inside, the heat intensified, and the red glow of magma pools illuminated the deep caverns. Dwemer soldiers clad in thick, geometric armor waited for them, standing beside towering brass constructs driven by steam and gears. The clash echoed down the stone corridors. Chimer spears struck Dwemer shields, producing sharp clangs that rang in the ears. Brass machines swung massive bladed arms, crushing stone and bone indiscriminately. Sotha Sil moved through the chaos with calculated precision. He unleashed blasts of kinetic force that dented the metallic plating of the constructs, halting their gears and dropping them to the stone floor. He summoned gouts of flame to melt the intricate mechanisms of the Dwemer engines. Alongside him, Nerevar swung his blade, cutting a path through the Dwemer defenders. Almalexia and Vivek fought at the flanks, driving the enemy deeper into the mountain. The Chimer generals pushed their way into the lowest depths of the stronghold, eventually breaking through a pair of heavy vault doors. They stepped into a massive cavern known as the Heart Chamber. A giant, fleshy mass hung suspended in the center of the room, bound by thick Dwemer metal and surrounded by scaffolding. It beat with a steady, deep rhythm that vibrated through the floorboards and shook the loose pebbles on the ground. Sotha Sil felt the hum in his teeth. Sweat rolled down the faces of the Chimer as they faced the remaining Dwemer leaders. King Dumak stood between the Chimer and the giant heart, wielding a heavy warhammer. Nerevar charged forward, his blade meeting Dumac's weapon with a shower of sparks. The two leaders traded heavy blows, their boots sliding on the slick stone. Dumac swung wide, and Nerevar drove his blade directly into the Dwemer king's chest. Dumac dropped his hammer. The heavy metal head struck the ground with a loud crack. Dumac collapsed, blood pooling on the dark stone beneath him. High tonal architect Kagranak stood near the scaffolding, watching his king fall. The Chimer generals turned their weapons toward him and advanced. Kagranax backed up against the giant heart. He reached into his robes and pulled out 3 distinct items. He slid a thick, glowing brass gauntlet onto his left hand. In his right hand, he gripped a short blade that hummed with a high-pitched frequency. A heavy, intricate hammer hung from his belt. Sotha Sil watched Kagranak's hands, observing the precise grip on the tools. Kagranak raised the short blade and the hammer. He struck the surface of the giant heart with the hammer, and a deep, resonating boom echoed through the chamber, pushing the Chimer back a step. Kagranak then applied the short blade to the exact spot he had struck. A blinding flash of white light filled the cavern, stripping all shadows from the walls and forcing Sotha Sil to shield his eyes. A high, ringing tone pierced the air, vibrating at a frequency that caused the ground to shudder violently. The light held for a long moment, burning the retinas before fading back to the dim red glow of the magma pools. Sotha Sil lowered his arm and blinked the spots from his vision. Kagranak had disappeared. Sotha Sil looked around the massive chamber. The Dwemer soldiers who had been fighting the Chimer forces just moments before were gone entirely. Piles of grey ash lay on the stone floor, surrounded by empty suits of geometric armor. Swords, axes, and shields clattered to the ground, echoing in the suddenly quiet cavern. Steam hissed from the pipes of the remaining brass constructs, which continued to march in circles or stand completely still. Faint, translucent figures of Dwemer forms lingered for a brief second near the walls before fading into the air. Nerevar, Almalexia, and Vivek stood with their weapons drawn, breathing heavily as they stared at the empty armor scattered across the floor. They looked at the massive heart, still beating in its metal restraints. Sotha Sil stepped forward, walking past the piles of ash and the abandoned breastplates. He approached the spot where Kagranak had stood. On the stone floor lay the thick brass gauntlet, the humming short blade, and the heavy hammer. Sotha Sil crouched down, keeping his eyes on the discarded items. He studied the etchings on the metal and listened to the faint vibrations still radiating from the blade as Nerevar stepped up beside him, carrying a heavy sack to gather the strange instruments from the floor. Indaril Nerevar walked out from the basalt gates of Red Mountain with 3 items wrapped in thick guar hide. He carried a heavy hammer called Sunder, a short blade named Keening, and a thick brass gauntlet known as Wraithguard. Ash fell in thick grey flakes around his boots, settling on the shoulders of his armor. Chimer soldiers sat around small fires across the jagged slopes, binding their cuts with linen and scraping dried blood from their weapons. Nerevar brought the wrapped items to a stone shrine dedicated to the Daedric prince Azura, set beneath the open, star-filled sky. He knelt on the volcanic rock, placed his hands on the wrapped bundle, and spoke an oath. He promised to leave the tools untouched and to never draw upon the power of the heart of Lorcan that lay buried beneath the crater. Sotha Sil stood nearby, watching the ash gather on the hide wrappings. After the oath, Nerevar entrusted the items to his counselors for safekeeping while he attended to the broken army. Sotha Sil took the tools into his own tent, lit a row of tallow candles, and unrolled the hide. He sat on a wooden stool and spent hours running his fingertips over the metal. He traced the tonal grooves etched into the heavy head of Sunda and measured the crystalline edge of keening against the candlelight. He tapped the metal with small iron rods, listening to the hum that vibrated through the air. The pitch and frequency of the sound matched the residual magics he had felt deep within the mountain's core. In the days that followed, Sotha Sil walked alone through the abandoned Dwemer strongholds scattered across the ashlands. He stepped over piles of grey dust, resting inside empty suits of brass armor. Copper pipes hissed with escaping steam, and massive iron gears turned smoothly in the walls, driven by subterranean heat. Mechanical spiders with glass eyes skittered across the stone floors, repairing broken vents and polishing the bronze grates. Sotha Sil crouched beside the machines, watching the pistons pump and the gears lock together. He recorded their movements on parchment, drawing precise diagrams of the tonal architecture with charcoal and ink. He studied the tuning forks and the resonators, matching them to the exact shapes of Kagranak's tools. Back in his tent, Sotha Sil spread his parchments across a wide wooden table. He overlaid the schematics of the tools with the anatomical drawings of the Chimer body. He calculated the flow of energy required to alter flesh, bone, and blood. By measuring the tonal frequencies generated by keening and Sunda, he mapped out a process to draw raw energy from the heart of Lorcan and channel it directly into a mortal vessel. His charcoal lines traced the exact path the power would take, bypassing the lethal heat of the heart through the protective layers of Wraithguard. He filled 3 ledgers with numbers and geometric patterns, documenting the exact method to permanently reshape a mortal frame. The mathematics showed a clear result. The wielder would stop aging, stop bleeding, and acquire a reservoir of energy vast enough to level mountains and command the oceans. Sotha Sil gathered the parchments and the 3 tools, bringing them to a secluded pavilion on the edge of the camp. He called for Almalexia and Vivek to join him. The 3 of them stood around a stone table under the shadow of a heavy canvas canopy. The air smelled of sulfur and burning kwama dung from the surrounding campfires. Sotha Sil laid the tools on the table alongside his open ledgers. He pointed to the charcoal diagrams, tracing the lines of force with his index finger. He spoke in a low, steady voice, detailing the exact sequence of strikes required to extract the divine energy. Almalexia leaned over the table, her eyes tracking his finger across the page, her breath catching as she stared at the final calculations. Vivek stood perfectly still, his gaze fixed on the crystalline edge of keening, watching the candlelight refract through the polished glass. Sotha Sil explained how the energy would bind to their physical forms, how it would grant them the power to heal the broken land and rule Resdain with absolute authority. He pushed the heavy brass gauntlet across the stone, letting it rest squarely between the 3 of them. Outside the pavilion, Indaril Nerevar walked among the wounded soldiers, offering water and distributing bandages. His footsteps crunched in the fresh ash as he moved from fire to fire, keeping his oath to the Daedric prince. Inside the pavilion, the 3 counselors stood in complete silence, looking from the brass tools to the parchment, and then slowly turning their heads toward the opening in the canvas, where Nerevar's silhouette moved against the campfire light. Sotha Sil sat at a heavy wooden table inside a canvas tent, tracing the metallic grooves of Sunda and keening with his fingertips. The campfire outside cast moving shadows over the heavy fabric walls. Sotha Sil held the short blade, keening, near a candle flame, watching the yellow light refract through the crystalline edge. He struck a small metal tuning fork and placed it against the blade's hilt. The crystal absorbed the vibration and produced a faint blue light that illuminated his face. He recorded the frequency on a piece of thick parchment with a quill. He measured the weight of Sunda, running his hands over the deep geometric engravings on the hammer's head. He spent days calculating and matching the angles of the tools to the exact curvature of the giant heart, suspended deep inside Red Mountain. He mapped out the precise strikes and cuts required to siphon the raw energy out of the tissue and channel it into a mortal vessel. Sotha Sil wrapped the tools in heavy cloth and carried them to a secluded clearing in the ash plains. Almalexia and Vivek stood waiting near a pile of dark volcanic rocks. Sotha Sil unwrapped the hammer and the blade, setting them down on a flat stone. He laid out his parchment maps next to the weapons. He pointed to the diagrams of the heart, moving his finger along the drawn lines of energy. He explained the resonance, the tonal frequencies, and the exact physical process of drawing power from the organ. He detailed how they could absorb the light, change their flesh, and elevate themselves above the physical limits of their current bodies. Almalexia stared at the glowing tools, reaching out to hover her hand over the sharp edge of keening. Vivek traced the lines on the map, nodding slowly as he examined the math. The three of them rolled up the parchment, gathered the tools, and walked back toward the military camp. Indaril Nerevar lay on a low wooden cot in the center of the main command tent. Deep lacerations covered his chest, and his skin had turned the color of pale ash. Blood soaked through his linen bandages, dripping slowly off the edge of the mattress and pooling on the woven rug beneath the cot, filling the enclosed space with the heavy scent of copper and sweat. His chest rose and fell in shallow, uneven intervals, each breath producing a wet rattle in his throat. Sotha Sil, Almalexia, and Vivek stood in a tight circle around the cot. Nerevar's eyes stared up at the fabric ceiling of the tent. His breathing stopped. His chest settled and remained completely still. The three counselors looked at the body. Sotha Sil picked up a damp cloth and wiped a smear of blood from his own wrist. They turned their backs on the cot, walked out of the tent, and headed directly for the deepest tunnels of Red Mountain. They left Azura's warnings spoken into the air behind them, descending through the dark rock with the tools securely in hand. The cavern floor shook with a steady, rhythmic thud. The heart of Lorcan hung suspended in the center of the chamber, a massive red mass of flesh bound by heavy Dwemer metal brackets. Thick veins pulsed across its surface, emitting a bright crimson light that cast long, shifting shadows against the cavern walls. Sotha Sil walked to the edge of the stone platform directly beneath the heart. He picked up Sunda. He tightened his grip on the haft, raised the heavy hammer above his shoulder, and brought it down against the exact center of the organ. A loud crack echoed through the chamber, vibrating against the stone walls. A ring of white energy blasted outward, knocking loose rocks from the ceiling, kicking up clouds of ancient dust, and turning the air hot and dense. Sotha Sil dropped the hammer and picked up keening. He stepped forward and pressed the crystalline edge of the blade directly into the point where the hammer had struck. He dragged the blade downward, slicing through the outer membrane. Searing white light poured from the cut, flowing down the metal of the blade and wrapping tightly around Sotha Sil's arms. Sotha Sil directed the stream of light toward Almalexia and Vivek. The energy enveloped their bodies, sinking into their pores and illuminating the veins beneath their skin. The cavern air thickened, pushing heavily against their chests and eardrums. The temperature spiked, melting the edges of the metal brackets holding the heart. Gold light poured from Sotha Sil's eyes and mouth. His skin pulled tight over his bones, and he grew physically taller, his muscles and tendons swelling and shifting with the raw influx of power. Almalexia and Vivek underwent the exact same physical expansion, their bodies radiating a blinding aura that illuminated the darkest corners of the deep cavern. They had reshaped their own physiology, forging themselves into the Almsivi in the ambient heat of the mountain. Sotha Sil took his place as the Magus, the architect of their ascension, his hands still vibrating with the frequency of the heart. The three of them turned away from the suspended organ and walked back up the long incline of the tunnel. Their footsteps left glowing footprints in the dust. As they emerged from the dark passage and stepped out onto the ash-covered slopes of Red Mountain, the sky above them fractured. The grey clouds tore apart violently, and a towering physical manifestation of a woman materialized in the air, her eyes burning as she stared down at the three glowing figures on the mountainside. Azura materialized in the cavern. The scent of ozone and crushed rose petals filled the heavy underground air. She stood tall, draped in a gown that shimmered with the light of distant stars, holding the physical symbols of the moon and the star in her hands. She spoke, and her voice echoed off the stone ceiling, promising a violent, permanent transformation for the entire Chimera race, in retribution for the stolen divine power. She thrust her hands forward, sending a shockwave of purple energy washing over the newly formed gods. The energy surged outward, piercing the mountain rock and rolling rapidly across the ash plains of Resdain. The physical change took hold immediately. Across the region, farmers dropping their hoes, scholars dropping their scrolls, and soldiers dropping their weapons, stared at their own hands. The pale, golden hue of their skin darkened, settling into the flat, slate-grey color of volcanic ash. They looked at each other and saw their eyes shifting, the pupils and irises dissolving into a solid, burning red. The Chimera transformed completely into the Dunmer, the Dark Elves. Within the cavern, the new gods felt the curse wash over their bodies. With the power of the heart of Lorcan coursing through their veins, they possessed the strength to manipulate their own physical forms. Almalexia retained her golden skin, keeping the bright, untouched appearance of her ancestors. Vivek split his form down the middle, wearing golden skin on his right side and the new ashen tone on his left. Sotha Sil looked at his own hands and made his choice. He allowed the grey color to seep into his flesh and settle permanently into his skin. He let his eyes glow with the red fire of the curse. He embraced the exact appearance of the afflicted citizens. Through the settlements outside the mountain, elves scrambled in terror at their new reflections in the water troughs. They scrubbed their faces with rough pumice stones and river sand, leaving their skin raw and bleeding in an attempt to scrape away the grey tint. They wrapped thick linen cloths around their heads to hide their red eyes from their neighbors. Sotha Sil walked out of the mountain and traveled directly into the crowded, frantic streets. He climbed onto a raised stone platform in the center of the main plaza and pulled back his thick fabric hood. He showed the weeping crowds his own grey face and his own red eyes. He spoke to the gathered masses with a steady, echoing voice that carried over the plaza. He told them to wear the ash skin as a mark of their resilience. He explained that the red eyes would allow them to see the harsh truths of their environment with perfect clarity. He instructed them to view the physical change as a forging process, a necessary hardening of their bodies for the trials ahead. The elves in the crowd listened to the rhythmic cadence of his words. They looked at the face of their new god, seeing their own exact reflections in his features. Slowly, they unwrapped the linen cloths from their faces. They let the pumice stones drop to the dirt. They stood tall and presented their ashen skin to the open air, accepting the change. With the population calmed, the leaders set about reshaping the religion of the land. Masons took heavy iron hammers and steel chisels to the old shrines, sending clouds of stone dust into the air as they carved the visages of Almalexia, Vivek, and Sotha Sil into the grand pillars of the central temples. Scribes sat at long wooden tables, dipping feathered quills into pots of black ink and writing new doctrines on thick rolls of parchment. The ink on the parchment declared the founding of the tribunal temple, elevating the three companions to the position of living gods. The scribes wrote that the good Daedra had merely paved the way for this moment. The texts categorized Boethia as the anticipation of Almalexia, and Mephala became the anticipation of Vivek. Azura, the very entity who delivered the curse, was recorded in the ink as the anticipation of Sotha Sil. The new theology cast Sotha Sil as the mystery of the tribunal, the architect of time, and the embodiment of the concepts of maybe and now. The newly carved temples filled with chanting priests and the thick smoke of burning incense. Massive crowds of worshippers packed the courtyards to seek blessings. Almalexia and Vivek stood on the high stone balconies, raising their hands to the cheering thousands. Sotha Sil stood beside them for the initial ceremonies, observing the adulation and the sheer volume of the masses. He turned away from the stone railing and walked back into the dim, quiet corridors of his sanctuary. He sought out the empty chambers and the silent libraries, preparing to distance himself from the public eye and pursue the intricate, isolated projects taking shape in his mind. Following the formation of the tribunal, the three living gods divided their roles across the ashen landscapes of Morrowind. Almalexia and Vivek established grand temples in the major cities, walking directly among the crowds of the Dunmer. They wore brightly dyed silks and heavy gold jewelry, accepting offerings of dried saltris and kwama eggs from their followers. Sotha Sil took a different path, retreating deep into the shadowed halls of his private laboratories. The Dunmer gave him many titles, referring to him as the architect of time, the binder of oblivion, the father of mysteries, and the mystery of Morrowind. He spent his days surrounded by spinning brass armillary spheres, thick glass lenses, and heavy scrolls of vellum, working in total seclusion. To sustain their stolen divinity, the three gods required the power radiating from the heart of Lorcan. Once every year, Sotha Sil emerged from his isolation to join Almalexia and Vivek on a journey back to the deep, sweltering caverns of Red Mountain. They descended through the jagged basalt tunnels, stepping carefully over the cooled lava flows and the rusted metal plates left behind by the vanished Dwemer. The heat of the volcano pressed heavily against their bodies, and the scent of sulfur filled the air, yet they moved forward with purposeful, steady strides. The deep hum of the mountain vibrated through the soles of their boots. In the massive central chamber, the stone heart hung suspended within an array of heavy tonal brackets. Sotha Sil wore thick leather gloves to carry Kagranak's metallic tools in a specially crafted lockbox. He struck the stone with the heavy hammer sunder, causing a deep ringing sound to echo through the cavern, and then cut into the surface with the short blade keening. The raw, humming energy surged out, flowing directly into his veins. The power caused a bright aura to glow beneath his grey skin, fully restoring his physical and magical strength for another year. Back in his sanctuaries, Sotha Sil operated with a profound, observable distance from the events outside his walls. He viewed the world through a lens of absolute determinism, recording the paths of the stars and the daily routines of mortals as identical mathematical equations. He mapped the trajectory of falling ash and the shifts in political power using the exact same set of brass calipers. He possessed a sharp ability to calculate the movements of the great houses, detailing their future alliances and conflicts in his journals years in advance. When messengers brought urgent reports of border skirmishes or blighted crops, Sotha Sil simply nodded, his facial muscles completely relaxed, his breathing slow and steady. He observed the surface world, tracking the outcomes in thick leather-bound ledgers with precise, even ink strokes, maintaining total composure regardless of the events unfolding around him. The memory of Indaril Neravar remained a constant presence in his daily routines. In a private study lit by the soft blue glow of luminous mushrooms, Sotha Sil kept relics from the First Council. He laid out old war banners, worn fabrics, and the tarnished bronze armor pieces of his fallen friend on a long wooden table. He spent long hours tracing the deep weapon indentations on Neravar's old shields with his fingertips. He sat perfectly still in the dim light, staring at the rusted metal, replaying the events of Red Mountain over and over in his mind. He carried the weight of the Hortator's murder in the deliberate, slow way he moved through his halls, demonstrating a physical stillness that reflected the burden of his past actions. Over the passing centuries, Sotha Sil grew weary of the erratic, flawed patterns of the mortal realm. He looked at the crumbling stone walls of Mournhold, the diseased crops in the fields, and the violent ash storms tearing across the sky. He observed a world plagued by extreme weather, rotting wood, and failing bodies. He desired a space of absolute order, where every moving part served a precise function and all materials retained their original forms indefinitely. He began drafting new blueprints on massive sheets of parchment, securing them to the walls of his study. He drew detailed diagrams of spinning gears, interlocking cogs, and highly polished brass spheres. He documented the exact tensile strength required for brass ligaments and the precise volume of oil needed to lubricate massive subterranean pistons. He measured the frequencies of cut soul gems, tuning them to emit steady, constant light to replace the shifting cycle of the sun. He gathered huge quantities of raw copper, iron ore, and glass, storing them in vast subterranean vaults. Turning his attention away from the surface world completely, he poured his vast intellect and his stolen divine power into a massive new project. He carved out an enormous cavern deep beneath the bedrock of the capital, laying the foundation for a realm entirely constructed of metal, oil, and glass. Deep beneath the streets of Mournhold, past the sewage tunnels and the dust-covered ancestral catacombs, a sealed vault of heavy stone holds a spinning metallic sphere. The sphere measures roughly the size of a large netch floating over the ashlands. Copper and brass plates interlock across its surface, shifting and rotating along grooved tracks in a continuous, rhythmic motion. Steam vents from tiny exhausts, filling the stone vault with the smell of hot oil, sulfur, and burned copper. Inside this metal sphere rests the Clockwork City, the greatest creation of Sotha Sil. The god built this realm, referred to by his followers as the brass throat and the oil-slick tower of seamless assembly, as a physical and metaphysical space residing entirely separate from the larger world of Nirn. To step inside the spinning sphere, a traveler must stand before the rotating plates and channel specific magic into the entry mechanism. As the magical current pulls the traveler forward, it compresses their bones, shrinking their flesh and drawing them through a microscopic seam in the metal hull. The air grows hot during the transition, and the light shifts from the flickering torches of the vault to the bright, artificial glow of magic housed in glass tubes. The traveler lands on a platform of gridded steel, dwarfed by towering structures of brass and glass. The realm mirrors the mountains and valleys of Nirn through a compact, metallic construction. Trees made of braided copper wire stretch toward a sky built from massive, turning bronze gears. Rivers of highly refined, glowing oil flow through metal trenches, illuminating the banks in a stark blue light. Metal mountains rise in the distance, and their jagged peaks hold white-hot glass mimicking snow. Sotha Sil constructed the city as an extension of his own physical body and mind. His concentrated will directs the physical rotation of every gear and the flow of every oil stream. He determines the exact humidity of the air and the precise color of the artificial light shining from above. The residents of the city eat a thick, gray nutrient paste extruded from brass pipes in the dining halls, and Sotha Sil dictates the exact flavor of this paste on any given day. On one morning, the paste tastes exactly like baked ash yam covered in sweet melted butter. On another day, it carries the sharp, metallic tang of iron and ash. The inhabitants chew and swallow whatever flavor the god decides to synthesize, making their daily sustenance completely dependent on his current focus. The earliest layers of the city feature heavy bronze plating, square-cut stone blocks, and thick, riveted steam pipes. These lower sections carry the exact measurements and angles used by the ancient Dwemer tonal architects. Sotha Sil spent centuries dismantling the tools and measuring the buried ruins left behind by Kagranak's people. He recorded the gear ratios of Dwemer spiders and the heat tolerance of their centurions, applying those exact numbers to his first structures. The foundational pillars of the city bear the heavy, geometric designs of the lost elves. As the builders expanded the city upward and outward over the centuries, the materials changed. The upper levels feature sleek, polished steel and dark chrome. The rigid squares shift into curved, organic shapes, resembling beetles, scorpions, and blooming flowers cast in smooth metal. The god shifted from copying the vanished Dwemer to forging his own distinct creations, reshaping the metal into elegant forms he found pleasing to his own eye. The city serves as a sprawling forge where Sotha Sil experiments with the physical fabric of reality. He sits within a central dome of rotating rings and glass screens, and his hands physically wire into the control panels. From this seat, he molds the environment. He breeds new strains of glowing moss on the metal riverbanks, adjusting their luminescence by altering the chemical runoff in the water. He recalibrates the artificial weather patterns, sending showers of lukewarm, purified water down upon the streets to wash away the accumulated grease and metallic dust. The citizens walk along the metal paths, and their heavy boots clank against the steel grates. They breathe the filtered air, smelling constantly of ozone and hot metal. The god watches them through mechanical lenses mounted on the walls and street corners, adjusting the environment to test their physical reactions and improve the efficiency of the settlement. The mortal scholars share the streets of the brass fortress with other residents. Heavy footsteps ring out across the steel bridges as entirely mechanical beings march through the thoroughfares. These creations carry out the maintenance of the city, welding broken pipes with sparks of blue magic and carrying heavy crates of raw ore from the processing foundries. Beside them, stranger creatures prowl the outer wastes of the realm, blending synthetic flesh with metallic skeletons. These moving constructs roam the oil-slicked valleys and the copper forests, executing the specific tasks assigned to them by the god. at the center of the world, preparing the city for the next stage of his grand design. Brass automatons patrol the copper-plated streets of the Clockwork City. The residents call them factotums. These machines walk on jointed limbs of polished bronze, their glass eyes illuminated by the steady white light of soul gems housed within their chest cavities. Their vocal cords consist of vibrating copper strings, allowing them to issue commands, deliver messages, and recite public ordinances. They sweep the metallic walkways with stiff bristled brooms, tighten loose bolts on the building facades using built-in wrench attachments, and record the daily temperatures by punching holes into brass cards. Every factotum receives its instructions directly from the central processing sphere of Sotha Sil. To strike a factotum is to physically strike the clockwork god. Deep within the storage vaults of the brass fortress, older models stand completely still under thick layers of dust. One specific model, labeled the Precursor, rests on a heavy iron pedestal. Its chest plates and arm joints consist of scavenged dwarven metal, thick and angular, oxidizing with a dull green tint across the heavy dwarven plating. Beside it, the newer factotums possess slender, curved chassis of gleaming brass, completely abandoning the bulky aesthetics of the ancient Dwemer engineers. The Precursor remains on display, demonstrating the physical shift from Sotha Sil copying old dwarven scrap to producing his own unique, streamlined designs. Beneath the city streets, within the humid chambers of the halls of fabrication, biological flesh merges with mechanical parts. Synthetic amniotic fluid bubbles inside tall cylindrical glass vats. Inside these vats, hybrid creatures known as fabricants grow in the murky liquid. A verminous fabricant floats in the fluid, its reptilian scales stitched directly to a titanium spinal column. Steam hisses from overhead valves as automated iron needles inject heavy metallic fluids into the muscle tissues of the growing beast. Its legs end in sharp steel spikes, and thin copper wiring runs alongside its organic blood vessels. The air in these halls smells of ozone, copper dust, and raw, wet meat. When the gestation cycles finish, the glass vats drain. The fabricants drop onto the metal floor, breathe air into their biological lungs, and expel exhaust fumes from metal vents bolted to their rib cages. They roam the outer radii of the city, hunting mechanical pests and serving as guard beasts with their razor-sharp metallic jaws. Mortal scholars live and work among these machines. They are the Clockwork Apostles, men and women wearing heavy robes woven with copper threads. They gather in the central squares of the brass fortress, clutching leather-bound journals and taking precise measurements of the steam pressure releasing from the underground pipes. Many apostles bear mechanical enhancements of their own. A Dunmer woman writes notes on a parchment scroll using a hand made entirely of articulated silver joints. A male scholar walks on two brass legs, the pneumatic pistons hissing with every step he takes on the metal grating. They study the mathematical equations written on the walls by the factotums. They amputate their own organic limbs and replace them with metal prosthetics, modifying their bodies to match the exactness of the machines around them. They consume plain nutrient paste from tin bowls, focusing entirely on their physical studies. Sotha Sil dictates the exact angle of every gear, the precise temperature of the water flowing through the aqueducts, and the daily schedules of the apostles. When a young child approaches a working factotum and traces the exposed cogs on its leg with a finger, the machine pauses its task. It lowers its bronze head, points to the gear with a smooth metal finger, and explains the function of the mechanism in a steady, synthesized voice. It allows the child to watch the mechanism turn for a full minute before resuming its patrol. When a merchant kicks a factotum for blocking a pathway, the machine reacts with immediate force. The factotum grabs the merchant by the wrist, applying enough pressure to crack the bone, and hauls him across the copper tiles toward the heavy iron holding cells of the basilica. Sotha Sil observes every physical interaction through the glass eyes of his creations, enforcing strict, visible order over every biological and mechanical resident within the brass walls. Every action and reaction follows the vast, interconnected blueprints drawn by Sotha Sil. The apostles study these blueprints daily, tracing the lines of ink that stretch across the parchment, looking at diagrams that point toward a massive, singular engine meant to pull all biological and mechanical matter into one perfectly aligned structure. Inside the brass fortress, the Clockwork apostles walk through halls lit by continuous copper sparks. They wear robes of heavy spun fabric over bodies heavily modified by brass and glass. Many have replaced their natural arms with clicking, multi-jointed mechanical appendages. Oil drips from their knuckles as they unfurl scrolls of hammered tin and read the doctrines written by Sotha Sil. They study the foundational nature of the universe, focusing on the primordial entity known as Anu. According to their texts, Anu fractured into countless pieces, creating a flawed reality of endless division and conflict. The apostles call this fractured state the multitudes. To heal this fracture, the apostles practice the doctrine of convergence. They actively synthesize living flesh with engineered metal. In their surgical bays, acolytes lie on stone tables, while metalworkers graft brass plating directly onto their rib cages. Surgeons run highly conductive copper wires alongside natural blood vessels, suturing the skin over the metal with precise, even stitches. They pull thick, amber sap from the synthetic trees and mix it with refined machine oil to lubricate their rotating joints. By merging myrrh and machine, they merge nature and engineering, working to forge a single, unified existence. The apostles state that this physical convergence will pull the scattered pieces of Anu back together, restoring the universe to a flawless whole. Through these teachings, Sotha Sil addresses the legacy of the vanished Dwemer. The apostles trace their metal fingers over detailed diagrams of old dwarven machines and label them as the greatest threat to reality. The texts describe the Dwemer ghosts wailing the word multitudes over and over, trapped in the chaos of their own making. The Dwemer built the Numidium, a towering golem constructed of bronze and powered by the heart of Lorcan. The apostles point to massive tapestries woven with metal threads, depicting the Numidium. The machine's head scrapes the heavy storm clouds, and its massive brass feet flatten entire mountain ranges into dust. The texts describe the Numidium as a welded knot at the center of Anu, a profound error in the fabric of existence. Its tonal mechanisms shatter the laws of space, causing the ground to buckle and the air to bleed with discordant sound. Sotha Sil studies the schematics of this brass god in his private dome, tracing the flaws in its design with a charcoal pencil. He plans to untie that knot and erase the error. He sits at his workbench, surrounded by the smell of hot copper, melted solder, and ozone. His long, calloused fingers manipulate fine iron tweezers, placing a microscopic gear into the chest cavity of a small mechanical bird. He seeks to redeem a flawed creation. He looks at the ash storms, the cracked earth, and the diseases ravaging the surface of Morrowind, and he responds by building a world governed by absolute mathematical precision. Within the Clockwork City, Every storm is scheduled by turning cranks, and every drop of rain falls exactly where the atmospheric regulators calculate it should. He solders the final wire in the bird's chest, winds the steel mainspring, and watches the creature flap its articulated brass wings. As he watches the bird fly across the workshop, his red eyes narrow. He spots a slight hesitation in the left wing, a friction caused by a single millimeter of misalignment in the shoulder joint. He sees the imperfection immediately. He picks up another loose gear from his desk, staring closely at the tiny scratches on the metal surface left by the milling tools. He recognizes the flaws in his own hands, the ash covering his Dunmer skin, and the biological limitations of his physical form. He seeks to remove all imperfection from the world, and he sees imperfection in every single object he touches. This tension drives his every action and keeps his hands moving constantly. He catches the mechanical bird, disassembles its casing, and begins machining a completely new gear from a block of raw iron. He grinds the metal on a spinning whetstone, showering his workbench in bright golden sparks. He builds and rebuilds, adjusting pinions and tightening ratchets hour after hour. He does this because he loves the physical world deeply. He looks through his windows at the brass trees, the simulated sun moving along its grooved track in the artificial sky, and the glass meadows reflecting the light. He loves the shape of reality enough to spend his entire immortal existence trying to fix it. He works continuously, shaping raw ore into perfect spheres, striving for a synthesis that will outlast the gods themselves. He soon places his tools down on the scorched wood of his desk and turns his gaze away from the small mechanisms. He looks upward, staring through the thick glass dome of his sanctum and beyond the metallic sky of the Clockwork City. His vision extends into the vast, dark void surrounding the mortal plane. He traces the energetic ley lines connecting Nirn to the swirling, chaotic realms of oblivion. He reaches out with his bare hands, weaving complex wards of solid purple light that ripple across the aether. He binds the dimensional gates and locks the magical pathways leading from the Daedric spheres, preparing his defenses for the ancient enemies waiting in the dark. Deep within the lowest levels of the Clockwork City, Sotha Sil stood over a circular table carved from a single slab of star metal. He traced the engraved lines connecting the mortal realm to the planes of oblivion with a metallic finger. The Dunmer called him the Binder of Oblivion, a title earned through his travels across the realms of the Daedric princes. He walked across plains of burning ash in the Deadlands and navigated forests of crystalline thorns in the Shivering Isles. He confronted the princes of Oblivion in their own domains, stepping onto grounds of jagged bone and rivers of molten rock. Gathering them in a space of cold stone and grey skies, Sotha Sil negotiated a binding agreement. He stood before 8 towering figures of Daedric power and presented a pact written on scrolls of cured Daedroth skin. The princes agreed to remain within their own realms and halt their physical manifestations in Morrowind. In exchange, Sotha Sil offered the cessation of specific cult worship among the Dunmer and provided the princes with rare souls and secrets from his own studies. Sotha Sil secured this pact through displays of vast magical force, breaking a mountain in half to demonstrate his power, and bound the princes to the agreement with signatures in Daedric blood. Returning to his dome, Sotha Sil constructed devices of spinning gyroscopes and glass lenses to monitor the realms. One such machine, the Probabilis, consisted of hundreds of copper rings rotating around a core of captured starlight. He used these machines to view branching timelines and calculate probability. He turned a brass crank and the glass lenses aligned, projecting images onto the stone wall. He watched images of mortal choices flicker through the light, tracking the physical consequences of every decision. He saw a farmer planting seeds in wet soil, the wheat growing tall, and the subsequent harvest filling wooden carts. He saw the same farmer leaving the field barren, the soil cracking under the sun, and the town starving. Through these observations, Sotha Sil developed his uncanny foresight. He viewed outcomes first, watching the end of a sequence play out in the lenses, and then worked backward to deduce the steps that led to that specific conclusion. He mapped the sequence of falling rain, shifting tectonic plates, and moving armies, treating every physical event as a mechanical gear turning another gear in a vast engine. Among the Daedric sigils on his star metal table, one symbol appeared more frequently than the others, and it was the horned emblem of Mehrunes Dagon. Sotha Sil kept pieces of scorched stone and melted iron from the ruins of Ald Sotha arranged on a wooden shelf near his scrying pool. He frequently picked up these stones, letting the ancient soot stain his metallic fingers. The smell of burning flesh and charring wood from that rainy morning remained clear in his mind. The Daedric princes adhered to the terms of the pact, limiting their direct interference in Morrowind, yet Sotha Sil tracked the movements of the Prince of Destruction. He monitored the cults dedicated to Dagon, watching their rituals through his viewing lenses. He observed cultists drawing symbols in animal blood and sacrificing captives on obsidian altars. He catalogued their numbers, their locations, and their methods of summoning. Through the rotating rings of the probabilis, Sotha Sil watched a specific sequence of physical events lock into a singular outcome. The copper rings spun rapidly, locking into place with loud clicks, and a clear projection appeared on the wall. He saw a Dunmer woman standing in the ash-covered wilderness of Morrowind. Tears ran down her face, and she dragged a silver knife across her own palms, letting the blood drip onto the dry soil. Her lips moved, chanting syllables of summoning directed at the Deadlands. The projection shifted, showing the sky over the city of Mournhold cracking open, pouring red light and falling cinders onto the paved streets. He saw the massive, four-armed figure of Mehrunes Dagon stepping through the tear in reality, holding axes of black iron and roaring above the burning buildings. Sotha Sil adjusted the brass dials on his machine, locking the location and the time into place. He stepped away from the table, taking up his metallic staff and securing a set of god bronze whips at his belt. He sent a telepathic summons to Almalexia, preparing to travel to Mournhold. The long-awaited confrontation with the destroyer of his childhood home was about to begin. A Dunmer witch named Turala stands in the center of a wide dirt road on the outskirts of Mournhold. She holds a jagged flint knife over her left palm and slices through the skin. Blood drips onto the dust. She speaks harsh syllables in the Daedric tongue, her voice cracking under the strain of the incantation. The air above the city warps, turning the color of dried blood. A massive tear opens in the sky, spilling the scent of boiling sulfur and burning hair across the streets. Through this rupture, Mehrunes Dagon steps onto the cobblestones of the capital. The four-armed entity towers over the temple domes. He grips a weapon forged in the fires of the Deadlands in each hand, a double-bladed iron axe, a spiked mace, a curved longsword, and a jagged spear. His cloven hooves crush the stone market stalls into powder. Fire rains from the portal, igniting the wooden roofs of the surrounding homes. Scamps and Dremora pour through the rift, slashing at the city guards with hooked blades. The guards fall, their chitin armor splintering under the heavy blows, their bodies bleeding out onto the paving stones. Two figures materialize in the center of the burning plaza. Sotha Sil stands in his brass armor, his hands sparking with raw, white magicka. Beside him, Almalexia holds her curved blade, Hope's Fire. The metal of her sword glows a bright, searing yellow, casting harsh shadows across the ruined square. They stand directly in the path of the towering Daedra. Mehrunes Dagon swings his massive iron axe down at the cobblestones. Almalexia leaps off a collapsed stone pillar, darting under the arc of the heavy weapon. She drives Hope's Fire directly into Dagon's red abdomen, sinking the glowing metal deep into his flesh. She pulls the blade upward, carving a deep trench through his chest. Boiling black ichor pours from the wound, steaming and hissing as it hits the pavement. Dagon roars, a sound of grinding tectonic plates that shatters the stained glass in the nearby temple windows. He brings his other three hands down in a sweeping motion to crush her against the stones. Sotha Sil steps forward. He thrusts his hands toward the ground, drawing up a pool of molten god bronze from beneath the earth. He shapes the liquid metal into long glowing cords, forming whips of searing heat. He snaps his wrists forward, the bronze lashes crack through the smoke, wrapping tightly around Dagon's thick red wrists and his broad throat. The metal sears the prince's flesh, sending up plumes of acrid smoke as the bronze burns into the muscle. Sotha Sil pulls the whip's taut, anchoring his heavy boots into the shattered stone. He looks up at the massive entity that burned the gardens and fish ponds of old Sotha. He pulls the bronze cords tighter, forcing the giant to halt his swing. Dagon struggles, twisting his massive frame and dragging Sotha Sil forward across the plaza. With a violent jerk, Dagon snaps his arm back, sending the spiked mace crashing into Sotha Sil's ribs. The impact throws the Clockwork god across the square, smashing him through a thick masonry wall. Dust and mortar cloud the air. Sotha Sil bleeds silver-red fluid onto the rubble. He stands up slowly, wiping the liquid from his chin. He walks back toward the giant, his boots crunching on the broken glass. Sotha Sil stops inches from Dagon's bleeding leg. He looks directly at the Daedra's face and speaks a single word. He whispers Dagon's secret mimic, the true name composing the Daedra's physical form. The sound of the word vibrates through the plaza, shaking the foundations of the surrounding buildings. Dagon's red flesh bulges outward. Deep fissures crack across his skin, glowing with violent internal light. The entity explodes in a shockwave of force, his massive form detonating into thousands of pieces of ash and sulfur smoke before hitting the ground. The blast knocks the remaining Scamps and Dremora backward, turning their bodies into grey dust that blows away in the wind. Sotha Sil extends his hands toward the rift above Mournhold. He weaves threads of blue light through the burning opening, physically pulling the edges of the portal together. The red light vanishes from the sky, replaced by the grey clouds of the mortal plane. He seals the doorways to the Deadlands, locking the Prince of Destruction firmly within the bounds of oblivion. He looks down at the grey ash of Dagon, mixing with the soot of the ruined market, watching the wind scatter the remnants over the cobblestones. Decades later, Sotha Sil retreats entirely into the hidden depths of his Clockwork city. He seals the heavy brass hatches, isolating himself from the marching armies and falling ash of the surface world. Deep within his mechanical realm, he turns his attention toward new calculations, adjusting the gears and pistons of his creation. Meanwhile, far above him, Another prince of oblivion begins weaving shadows into the very cogs of his sanctuary, moving silently toward the heart of the brass fortress. During the Second Era, the armies of three great alliances marched across the surface of Tamriel, driving their boots into the mud and striking steel against shields. Soldiers drove iron pikes into the dirt and raised banners over blood-stained fields. Miles beneath the marching armies, the brass gears of the Clockwork city turned steadily in the dark. Oil dripped from polished valves, and steam hissed from copper pipes. In this subterranean realm, Nocturnal, the Daedric prince of the Evergloam, sent her forces to breach the brass walls. She sought to claim the machinery for herself alongside her Daedric allies. Divaethfir walked through the metallic corridors of the brass fortress. He wore his heavy Daedric armor, the red plates scraping slightly as he moved. The ancient wizard lord of Telfir observed the Clockwork god standing on the balconies of the Cogitum Centralis, and noticed a stiffness in his friend's posture. The god issued commands contradicting his centuries of prior designs, ordering the immediate removal of light-emitting lanterns from the city streets. Divaethfir looked at the dimmed pathways and the heavy shadows lengthening across the brass floor. He recognized the deception immediately. The figure standing on the balcony consisted entirely of shadow. Nocturnal had separated Sotha Sil's shadow from his physical body, giving the dark silhouette a voice and form to rule the city in his place. The true Sotha Sil sat imprisoned, deep within the machinery of his own throne. In the lower levels of the brass fortress, Proctor Luciana Pullo examined the darkened streets. Her heavy clockwork limbs whirred and clicked with every step she took over the metal grating. She enlisted the help of a traveler known as the Vestige. Together they walked through the oil-stained alleys and inspected the empty lantern brackets. She shined a handheld luminizer into the spaces between buildings, illuminating the scuff marks on the walls. The missing lights allowed shades and Daedric creatures to slip through the darkened corners of the city. Luciana tightened her grip on her steel mace. She instructed the Vestige to gather the remaining Clockwork apostles and track the source of the shadow infiltration. The Shadow's rule depended on keeping the city sealed away from outside interference. A Daedric artifact, known as the Skeleton Key, surfaced within the city limits. Chancellor Gascoigne Dusant, a high-ranking apostle draped in white robes, plotted to hand the key over to the Daedric prince, Clavicus Vile. He carried the key through the maintenance tunnels, his boots splashing in shallow pools of runoff water. Before he could deliver the artifact, a flock of crows with sleek black feathers descended from the rafters. The birds, calling themselves the Black Feather Court, pecked at his hands and snatched the skeleton key in their beaks. They flew away, carrying the artifact into the deep vents of the radius. Gascoigne dropped to his knees, clutching his scratched hands. The crows flew through the exhaust pipes, their wings kicking up clouds of rust and dust. The Vestige tracked the scattered black feathers across the metal grating. They climbed through the maintenance shafts, crawling over rotating gears and ducking under venting steam. The crows hoarded shiny objects in a nest built from scrap wire and torn fabric. The Vestige reached into the pile of debris, pushing aside brass bolts and cracked glass, and retrieved the skeleton key. The metal of the key felt cold to the touch, shaped like a bone with intricate Daedric runes carved into its surface. Above ground, the shadow of Sotha Sil stood in the central plaza. It wore the familiar golden mask and brass appendages, while the metal absorbed the surrounding light, leaving its surface dull and dark. The air around the shadow shimmered with a cold purple haze. The shadow commanded the factotums to patrol the streets. The brass automatons marched in perfect synchronization, their heavy metal feet striking the ground in a steady rhythm. They pointed their lightning staffs at anyone approaching the restricted zones. Luciana Pulo watched from a hidden alcove. She listened to the mechanical hum of the factotums and the quiet, clicking whir of the shadow's artificial throat. Divaith Fear met with Luciana and the Vestige inside a small, sealed workshop. The walls were lined with spinning gyros and glowing memory stars. Divaith Fear pointed to a schematic of the Cogitum Centralis rolled out on a wooden table. He traced his armored finger along the ink lines leading down to the throne aligned. He explained that the shadow drew its power directly from Nocturnal's realm, filtering the darkness through the city's power grid. The true Sotha Sil remained trapped inside the throne aligned, locked inside a stasis pod of thick glass and swirling fluid. The Vestige placed the skeleton key on the table. The artifact glowed with a faint purple light. Divaith Fear instructed them to take the key into the Cogitum Centralis and unlock the throne's restraints. Luciana checked the pneumatic pistons in her artificial arm. The Vestige secured the skeleton key to their belt and drew their weapon. Divaith Fear unsealed the heavy steel doors leading out of the workshop. The hinges screeched loudly against the metal frame. The three of them stepped out into the dimmed corridors, walking past the dismantled lanterns and the expanding patches of shadow. They marched directly toward the entrance of the Cogitum Centralis, ready to break through the metallic barricades and face the darkness waiting at the core of the city. Deep beneath the brass fortress, thick metal doors seal the entrance to the Cogitum Centralis. Inside the massive spherical chamber, wide brass platforms suspend over a spinning core of copper wires and steam vents. Giant pistons drive up and down in steady rhythm, shaking the grated walkways. At the center of the highest platform sits the throne aligned, a massive chair constructed from interlocking gears, spinning gyroscopes, and heavy glass tubes. Sotha Sil rests within it, his head tilted back and his eyes closed. Thick metal clamps secure his wrists, waist, and ankles to the heavy frame. Standing directly in front of the throne is his shadow. It takes the exact shape of the Clockwork god, completely solid and cast in absolute blackness. Viscous, dark fluid drips from its fingertips and pools on the brass floor. From the corners of the room, Nocturnal's magic manifests as thick, oily smoke pouring through the ventilation shafts. The smoke crawls across the metal grating, staining the polished brass black and dropping the temperature in the room. Frost forms on the edges of the handrails. Divaith Fear steps onto the main platform and raises his staff. Bright violet light erupts from the crystal at the tip, striking the shadow directly in the chest. The impact sends a shockwave of heat across the room, rattling the glass tubes connected to the throne and melting the frost on the rails. Proctor Luciana Pulo flanks the wizard, raising her right arm. Her clockwork limbs whir loudly as heavy gears spin inside her shoulder joint. She fires continuous blasts of concentrated blue energy from her wrist projector, targeting the encroaching oily smoke. The blue blasts scorch the metal floor, burning the dark residue into ash. The shadow raises its dark hands, and jagged spikes of black glass shoot outward, deflecting Fear's violet light. The oily smoke thickens, pouring out from the vents in greater volume. It creeps over the spinning gears and coats the brass floor in a slippery dark film. The darkness spreads closer to the throne, threatening to cover the entire platform in shadow. Fire channels more magicka, sweat forming on his brow, as he forces a wide dome of violet light to expand outward, physically pushing the smoke back toward the walls. Luciana pushes forward, her metal boots clanking heavily against the grating. She steps directly into the path of the black glass spikes, drawing the shadow's attacks toward herself to clear a path for the vestige. The vestige runs through the narrow gap between Fear's violet dome and the creeping smoke. In their hand, they hold the skeleton key. The artifact consists of bleached bone and dark metal, glowing with a faint, cold blue luminescence. The shadow turns its head toward the vestige and raises a hand to strike. Luciana intercepts, stepping in front of the vestige. A black glass spike pierces her torso, driving right below her mechanical lung. She grunts loudly, gripping the protruding spike with her metal hand, and fires another point-blank blast of blue energy into the shadow's chest, staggering the entity backward. The vestige reaches the base of the throne aligned. The locking mechanism sits in the center of the brass console, covered in complex Dwemer-style tumblers and spinning cylinders. The vestige grips the skeleton key and drives it directly into the primary keyhole. The bone metal shifts and alters its shape, molding perfectly to match the internal pins of the lock. The vestige turns the key clockwise. Heavy metallic clicks echo through the chamber, loud enough to be heard over the pistons. The thick metal clamps retract from Sotha Sil's wrists, waist, and ankles. The glass tubes disengage, hissing loudly as pressurized steam vents into the air. Sotha Sil opens his eyes. The moment his eyelids part, the shadow violently jolts backward. The dark entity dissolves into a stream of black mist and rushes directly into Sotha Sil's chest, merging completely back into his physical form. Sotha Sil stands up from the throne aligned. He raises his right hand, and the giant gears rotating the cogitum centralis suddenly accelerate. The friction generates a blinding white light that pulses outward from the central core. The light strikes the oily smoke. The smoke boils, turning to grey ash before dissipating completely into the ventilation grates. The dark fluid on the floor evaporates. Nocturnal's presence is purged from the room, leaving only the polished brass and the sharp smell of ozone. Sotha Sil had prepared for this exact sequence of events, allowing the shadow to sit on the throne until the skeleton key could be delivered directly into his chamber. Proctor Luciana Pullo collapses onto her knees. The blue light in her mechanical lung flickers rapidly, dimming with each passing second. Fear lowers his staff and walks to her side. Luciana falls onto her back, her biological eye staring up at the vaulted ceiling. The gears in her shoulder slow down, clicking sporadically before stopping completely. The light in her chest fades to dark grey. Sotha Sil descends the steps of the throne and stands over her body. He looks at her face, observing the stillness of her mechanisms, and then he turns his gaze toward the vestige. The vestige pulls the skeleton key from the console and holds it out. Sotha Sil takes the key, examining the bone and metal structure under the bright lights of the chamber. He turns his head toward Divaith Fear, signaling that they must now speak about the future of the artifact and the departure of the ancient wizard. The copper cables unlatch from Sotha Sil's back, sliding across the metal grates and dropping into the circular slots on the floor. He stands from the throne aligned, his bronze-plated joints locking into place with a sharp click. His red eyes focus on Divaith Fear and the vestige. The heavy scent of ozone and hot oil fills the cogitum centralis. Steam vents from the pipes lining the walls and gears the size of houses turn steadily above their heads. Sotha Sil speaks, his voice carrying a slight metallic echo against the spinning cogs around them. He details the exact movements Nocturnal will make, charting her physical retreat to her realm of Evergloam. He points toward the southern quadrant of the map, projected on the brass floor, identifying the Somerset Isles. He states that a third enemy from the Triad gathers forces there, organizing wooden ships and binding Daedric magic to the coastal coral reefs. Sotha Sil holds out his right hand. The skeleton key rests on his palm. The Daedric artifact hums, casting a deep purple glow over the bronze plating of his arm. The jagged edges of the key blur and shift in the light, reshaping themselves every few seconds. He extends it toward Divaith Fear. Sotha Sil knows of the ancient wizard's habit of collecting dangerous relics and hoarding them in the lower vaults of Tel Fear. He hands the key to the wizard, instructing him to take it back to the ash-covered plains of Vardenfell and lock it behind his thick iron vault doors. Divaith Fear steps forward in his spiked red Daedric armor and takes the heavy key, wrapping his calloused fingers around the dark metal. Sotha Sil looks directly at his old friend. He traces the exact sequence of events that will follow their departure and tells Divaith Fear that this meeting marks the final time they will speak. Divaith Fear pauses, his grip tightening on the artifact. Sotha Sil offers only the plain statement of the future as he calculates it. The ancient wizard nods, turning his back to the throne and walking toward the heavy brass doors of the chamber. His boots click against the grating until he disappears down the long corridor. Sotha Sil turns to the vestige. They stand near the base of the throne, surrounded by the constant hum of spinning dynamos and the oppressive heat radiating from the floor. Sotha Sil looks down at the mortal and answers the vestige's questions about his nature and his followers. He points to the brass walls, the factotums marching in precise lines, and the memory stars spinning in the glass tubes above them, glowing like spheres of trapped golden light. He compares his physical form to the polished glass mirrors found in the stone temples of Mournhold. He explains that the people of Morrowind look at him and see exactly what they require. He lists the shapes the people project onto him. Some look at his quiet nature and see a wise guardian holding a shield over their lands. Others look at the rigid laws of the Clockwork City and see a cruel oppressor binding them to a machine. Some project their desires for order onto his image, building stone shrines to his name and burning sweet-smelling incense at his altars. Others project their resentments, sharpening steel blades on grindstones in the ashlands and shouting his name as a curse around campfires smelling of burning gar-dung. Sotha Sil stands completely still as he speaks, his face holding a neutral expression. He accepts all these reflections. He states that he is merely a canvas for the Chimera and the Dunmer, absorbing their prayers and their hatred alike, while maintaining his own design. The vestige departs, leaving Sotha Sil alone in the center of the Cogitum Centralis. The heavy brass doors seal shut with a loud slam, and the locking mechanisms grind into place. Sotha Sil walks back to his throne, sitting down as the copper cables reattach to his spine. He closes his eyes and returns his focus to the great machine around him. The brass gears rotate millions of times. The pistons pump continuously. Above ground, ash layers build up on the stone roofs of Aldrun, and the snow thaws and freezes over the jagged Velothi mountains. As the brass gears turn over the decades, Sotha Sil, Almalexia, and Vivek travel to the volcanic crater of Red Mountain to bathe in the power of the heart of Lorkhan, maintaining their divine forms. They march through the thick ash storms, carrying Kagranak's tools to the center of the mountain, performing the ritual and drawing the raw energy into their bodies. Deep in the ash-choked tunnels of Red Mountain, Dagoth awakens from his long slumber. He gathers his ash vampires in the dark caverns, sharpening their claws and preparing their spells. They wait in the shadows of the jagged rock formations, listening to the footsteps of the tribunal echoing down the tunnel. The time for the pilgrimage arrives, and the tribunal walks straight into the waiting ambush. In the 417th year of the Third Era, thick grey ash coated the jagged basalt paths of Red Mountain. Sotha Sil, Almalexia, and Vivek made their annual pilgrimage up the steep slopes, their boots crunching on the volcanic rock. They carried the ancient Dwemer artifacts, Keening and Sunder, intending to bathe in the divine energies of the heart of Lorcan, hidden deep within the mountain's core. The air grew hot, smelling of sulfur and burning rock as they approached the cavern entrance. Dagoth and his ash vampires emerged directly from the red dust storms. The ambush struck quickly. The ash vampires possessed elongated limbs, sharp claws, and distorted faces with long snouts. They lunged at the three gods, tearing into their robes and flesh. Claws scraped against Sotha Sil's metallic arm, ripping through the fabric of his mantle. Almalexia swung her blade, severing limbs, while Vivek unleashed bursts of raw magic that scorched the rock walls. Yet, the sheer number of ash vampires overwhelmed them. The twisted creatures swarmed the tribunal, tearing Keening and Sunder from their grasp. Dagoth claimed the ancient tools, holding them high as the dust swirled around his golden mask. Bleeding and stripped of their instruments, the tribunal retreated down the mountain. They walked away from the heart of Lorcan, leaving the source of their divinity in the hands of their oldest enemy. The physical connection to the heart severed completely. The golden radiance that had always illuminated their skin began to dim. Their steps grew heavier, and the wounds inflicted by the ash vampires closed at a fraction of their usual speed. Consequently, Sotha Sil left the surface world entirely. He retreated into the Clockwork city and stepped past the heavy bronze doors of the brass fortress. The large metal gates slammed shut, sealing him inside the metaphysical realm. He walked past the Clockwork apostles and the marching factotums in complete silence. He entered the deepest vault, the Cogitum Centralis, and locked the entrance from the inside. The heavy gears turned, grinding against each other as the deadbolts slid into place. The smell of ozone and heated oil filled the enclosed space. Inside his sealed chamber, Sotha Sil began constructing a replacement for the lost divine source. He assembled a massive sphere of brass, quartz, and copper wiring, designing it to mimic the mythic properties of the original heart. He named it the Mechanical Heart. He stood before the giant structure for hours at a time, soldering plates and adjusting valves. Luminescent blue and gold fluid pumped through thick glass tubes, illuminating the dark corners of the room. Sparks showered the metal floor as he welded the outer casing. Furthermore, he required tools to manipulate this new creation. Using steel, silver, and humming tonal crystals, he forged his own variants of Kagranak's instruments. He shaped a heavy hammer to replicate Sunder and ground a crystalline edge onto a short blade to serve as keening. He struck the metal on his anvil, the high-pitched rings echoing off the brass walls. He tuned the frequencies of the tools, aligning their vibrations with the pumping fluid of his artificial heart. He kept his gaze fixed purely on the spinning cogs and the dripping oil, dedicating every waking moment to the construction of the massive sphere. Meanwhile, Vivek sat on his levitating stone within his palace in Vivek City. He looked down at his own hands, studying the grey and gold skin. The surface appeared dry, the colors dulling like old paint left out in the sun. He spoke to his archcanons, describing the physical state of the clockwork god. Vivek noted that Sotha Sil remained completely surrounded by his machines, his eyes tracking the movement of copper pistons and steel gears. Vivek stated that Sil focused so entirely on the mechanics of his creations that the clockwork god ignored the fading luster of his own divine body. Outside the sealed walls of the clockwork city, the sky over Vardenfell turned a sickly red. Blight storms carried coarse, infected dust over the farmlands, covering the crops in grey rot. The Dunmer people developed red welts and hardened scales on their skin as the diseases spread from the mountain. In the capital of Mournhold, the stone walls developed deep cracks, and the once bright banners frayed in the dry wind. Down on the southern coast, a wooden prison ship bumped against the wooden docks of Cedar Neen. A lone prisoner stepped off the damp planks onto the island, arriving just as the fading power of the old gods pushed a mad queen to the brink of absolute ruin. Ash falls heavily on the slopes of Red Mountain, burying the tracks of a lone traveler. He carries the ring Moon and Star on his finger, marking him as the Nerevarine, the reincarnated warlord from ages past. He walks past ruined Dwemer pipes jutting from the rock, listening to the hiss of escaping steam, and steps into the sweltering cavern of the heart chamber. A massive bridge of stone spans a pool of boiling magma, and at the center of the chamber, the heart of Lorcan hangs suspended within a heavy Dwemer cage. Dagoth stumbles backward off the stone bridge and drops into the orange magma below, the molten rock swallowing his form. The Nerevarine raises the hammer sunder and strikes the heart. The sound of ringing metal echoes off the stone walls. He switches his grip to the short blade keening and strikes the heart again, dragging the blade across the divine tissue. The physical mass of the heart shrinks inward. The deep, rhythmic thumping that vibrated through the cavern floor and rattled loose stones fades into silence. The heart collapses into a tiny point and vanishes from view, leaving only the empty Dwemer cage hanging over the heat. The physical tether between the divine relic and the mortal plane snaps in an instant. Far away in the city of Mournhold, Almalexia sits upon her throne. The golden aura surrounding her skin flickers, dims, and fades away. Her shoulders slump forward against the backrest, the heavy fabric of her robes suddenly dragging her down. The muscles in her face draw tight, and she stares at her trembling hands. The power that sustained her body for thousands of years drains away, leaving behind the aches of ordinary flesh and the heavy weight of bone. Her breath comes in short, ragged gasps. The same sudden fatigue strikes Vivek inside his palace in Vardenfell. He lowers himself to the floor, his floating form touching the cold stone tiles as his levitation gives out. His jewel-colored skin loses its luster, turning dull under the brazier's light. Their bodies demand sleep and food, returning rapidly to the physical limitations of mortal elves. They shiver in the draughty halls of their temples. Almalexia paces across the polished marble floors of her sanctuary in Mournhold. Her bare feet slap against the stone, the sound echoing through the wide halls. She grips the handles of her throne until her knuckles turn white and her fingernails dig into the metal. She dismisses her handmaidens with sharp waves of her hands, shouting orders and demanding absolute obedience from the temple guards stationed at the doors. She stares at her reflection in the polished silver shields mounted on the walls. She traces the fine lines appearing at the corners of her eyes and the sagging skin along her jawline. She steps out onto her high balcony, raising her arms to the crowds gathered in the plaza below, demanding their loud cheers and offerings of flowers and coins. The loud noise of the crowd rings hollow against her starving, weakening frame. She turns away from the balcony, her jaw set tight, and walks deep into the lower vaults of her temple, flanked by ordinators holding drawn swords. Deep beneath the earth, inside the Clockwork City, Sotha Sil ignores the severance. He sits before a massive console of spinning dials, copper tubes, and glass pressure gauges. The metal arms of his factotums construct a new, mechanical heart within a sealed vault directly below his seat. He watches black oil drip from the joints of his machines and pool on the grated floorboards. He connects thick copper wires and solders metal plates together, keeping his eyes fixed on his workbench. He seals his lips, leaving the brass communication arrays to the city of Mournhold to gather dust. He watches the artificial sun of his dome cast long, sharp shadows across the brass floor. His breathing grows shallow, and his movements slow down as the divine energy leaves his veins, yet he keeps his hands firmly wrapped around his tools. He fastens a final gear into a spinning gyroscope, locking it in place with a heavy wrench. He remains seated in his observation dome, surrounded by the grinding, ticking noises of his own creation, letting the outside world fall apart. Back in Mournhold, Almalexia walks into her private armory. She lifts the curved sword Hopesfire from its velvet-lined display stand. She runs her thumb along the razor edge of the blade, drawing a thin line of red blood. She wipes the blood on her silk robes and turns her attention toward the artifact known as Barrelzar's mazed band. The heavy silver ring sits on a pedestal in the center of the room. She slides the ring onto her index finger, feeling the cold metal press against her skin. She turns her gaze toward the floor, visualizing the location of the Clockwork City buried deep below the surface. She begins calculating the precise sequence of portal incantations needed to step directly into the observation dome of the fellow god who ignored her, readying her blade for the strike. Almalexia lifted Barrelzar's mazed band into the light of the torches. She twisted the metal ring, aligning the inscribed runes along its outer edge. A portal of violet light tore through the air of the temple, smelling of ozone and burning copper. She stepped through the glowing tier and emerged into the Clockwork City. Brass walls towered on all sides, lined with spinning cogs and thick bundles of black wires. Oil slicked the grated floors beneath her golden boots. She walked past rows of dormant factotums, their spherical heads bowed against their metallic chests. Steam hissed from vents in the baseboards and coated her armor in a fine mist. She gripped the hilt of her sword, Hopesfire, pulling the curved blade from its scabbard. The metal edge scraped against the leather, catching the low light of the lumen bulbs overhead. She walked deeper into the facility, her silk robes dragging across the oily grates. She bypassed the outer chambers and headed straight for the central dome, where the gears ground heavily against one another and the pipes converged into massive copper trunks. Sotha Sil hung suspended in the center of the control dome. Thick tubes connected to his spine, and copper wires pierced the skin of his scalp. He typed on a wide brass console, his fingers pressing down on the keys as amber fluid pumped through the glass lines above him. Almalexia walked into the room, her boots clanking against the metal steps. She raised Hopesfire and brought the blade down across his back. The metal sliced through his robes and bit deep into his flesh. Red blood spilled down his sides and dripped onto the brass floorboards. Sotha Sil turned his head and looked at her. His facial muscles held completely still. His lips stayed pressed tightly together. He placed his hands back on the console and typed another sequence of commands. Almalexia screamed, her face flushing red, and drove the sword into his side. More blood poured from the wound, coating the wires attached to his ribs. He looked directly into her eyes, exhaled a slow breath, and turned his gaze back to the screens. The only sounds in the room came from the whirring machinery and the wet impact of her blade. Almalexia swung the sword again and again, hacking into his arms and chest. The fluid in the tubes turned red as his blood mixed with the machinery. As the blade struck his shoulder, Sotha Sil reached forward and pulled a heavy iron lever on the far side of the console. Beneath the dome, deep within the foundations of the city, massive stone slabs slid across the floor. Titanium deadbolts the size of tree trunks slammed into their brackets. The chamber of Lorcan locked down, sealing the mechanical heart behind thick layers of impenetrable metal. Sotha Sil entered a final command into the brass keyboard. Almalexia drove Hope's fire straight through his chest, piercing his lungs and severing his spine. Sotha Sil's hands slipped from the keys. His chin dropped to his chest. His eyes fixed their stare on the grating below. The heavy cables attached to his back held his weight, leaving his corpse dangling in the center of the control room. Blood dripped off his toes and pooled on the floorboards. Almalexia stood over him, her chest heaving, her gold mask smeared with his blood. She stared at his quiet, motionless face, then turned away and walked toward the fabrication terminals on the lower tier. She slammed her hands against the levers controlling the halls of fabrication. Down in the lower levels, glass vats drained their yellow fluid into the floor grates. Copper-limbed reptiles and saw-toothed mechanical beasts broke through their glass enclosures. The metal creatures crawled over the broken shards and marched in unison toward the teleportation arrays. Almalexia activated the portal sequence, targeting the city of Mournhold. The portal flared wide. The beasts charged through the violet light and emerged into the plaza of the capital. Their steel claws tore into the stone pavements. They lunged at the temple guards, sinking their metal fangs into armor and flesh. Blood sprayed across the white cobblestones. The citizens ran through the streets, bleeding from deep lacerations as the mechanical creatures tore through the market stalls and smashed the wooden carts into splinters. The city plaza filled with the stench of burning oil and the sight of mangled bodies scattered across the square. Almalexia stepped back through the portal and emerged into her private chambers in the Mournhold temple. She wiped the blood from her sword, using a white cloth, leaving a thick red stain on the fabric. She sheathed the blade and walked out into the reception hall. The Nerevarine stood waiting for her, holding the newly forged sword True Flame. The blade burned with a bright physical fire that cast flickering shadows across the tapestries. Almalexia pointed toward the heavy wooden doors leading to the plaza. She spoke of the mechanical beasts attacking the city outside, pointing out the metallic screeches echoing through the stone corridors. She blamed Sotha Sil for the attack, detailing his exact location in the Clockwork City and commanding the Nerevarine to travel there and execute him for the assault. The Nerevarine nodded, gripping the flaming hilt, and turned toward the portal chamber, stepping into the violet light to face the creator of the mechanical horde. The Nerevarine steps onto the interlocking metal grates of the Clockwork City, holding the reforged blade True Flame tightly in his grip. The metal of the sword emits a continuous orange glow, casting long, flickering shadows across the bronze-plated walls of the corridor. Thick steam vents push clouds of white vapor into the air, and the sharp scent of heated oil and sulfur fills the space. Giant cogs rotate behind thick glass panes, clicking steadily as they lock into place, driving the unseen machinery beneath the floorboards. The Nerevarine walks forward, and the heat from the steam presses heavily against his skin as he navigates the narrow, metallic passages. The path deep into the complex consists of shifting platforms, spinning blades attached to heavy iron axles, and massive steel pistons that slam down into deep grooves. Factotums, humanoid constructs built from overlapping brass plates and exposed wiring, step out from recessed alcoves to block the route. Sparks fly brightly as true flame slices through their metallic joints, severing their internal cables and spilling thick, dark fluid onto the grates. The Nerevarine moves methodically, stepping over the broken machines and pulling heavy iron levers to unlock the heavy bulkheads ahead. Each lever requires substantial physical force, groaning under the tension before releasing the pressurized locks of the doors. The final bulkhead grinds open, revealing the central dome of the complex. Cables of various thicknesses hang from the ceiling, connecting to large consoles covered in blinking glass dials and copper switches. In the exact center of the room hangs the body of Sotha Sil. Thick mechanical cords wrap tightly around his waist, wrists and ankles, suspending him completely off the floor. His chest remains entirely still, and his eyes stare blankly toward the far wall. A pool of dark, congealing blood stains the bronze tiles directly beneath him, matching the deep puncture wound in his chest. The machines attached to him continue to cycle, pumping clear fluids through transparent tubes, operating in their fixed, rhythmic patterns. A sudden flash of bright white light illuminates the entrance behind the Nerevarine, and Almalexia steps onto the metal floor. She wears a golden war mask and polished armor that reflects the orange light of true flame. In her grip, the sword Hope's Fire crackles with blue lightning, leaving a sharp smell of ozone in the heavy air. She speaks clearly, her voice echoing sharply off the curved metal walls of the dome. She details her explicit plan to leave the Nerevarine dying on this floor, alongside Sotha Sil. She describes how she will return to Mournhold and tell the Dunmer people that the Nerevarine struck down the Clockwork god, cementing her own position as their sole surviving savior. She tilts her head up to look at the suspended body of Sotha Sil. She recounts driving her blade into his chest, noting how he maintained absolute silence as the metal pierced his skin. She explains that his silence served as a final, deliberate insult, denying her any satisfaction or acknowledgement in his final moments. Almalexia raises Hope's Fire and lunges forward across the room. The blue lightning of her blade strikes the orange fire of true flame, and the impact sends a wave of intense heat and static electricity across the room, shattering the glass dials on the nearby consoles. The Nerevarine pushes her back, swinging the blazing sword in wide, heavy arcs. Almalexia parries the blows, her movements swift and practiced, while sweat streaks down her neck and chin. The blue glow of her sword flickers as she breathes heavily, her strikes slowing down. The Nerevarine finds an opening in her stance and drives True Flame forward, piercing directly through her golden armor and into her torso. Almalexia drops Hope's Fire, and the blade clatters against the metal grating, the blue lightning fading rapidly into cold, dark steel. She falls to her knees, grasping at the wound with both hands, before collapsing completely onto the floor beside the pool of Sotha Sil's blood. Her breathing stops, and the glow fades from her armor. The Nerevarine stands alone in the center of the vast dome, while blood drips slowly from the tip of True Flame. Above him, the mechanical cords holding Sotha Sil continue to hum with electric currents. The great pistons in the walls keep pumping, and the heavy gears beneath the floor keep turning. The Creator and the Queen lie still on the cold bronze tiles, while the vast machinery around them operates exactly as it was designed, maintaining a steady, unbroken rhythm into the future. The physical body of Sotha Sil hung from the thick copper wires, cold and motionless. Below him and all around him, the Clockwork City maintained its steady rhythm. Piston shafts drove up and down inside heavy brass cylinders. Gear teeth locked together and spun along the tall walls of the brass fortress. Factotums walked the metal corridors, carrying spools of copper wire, wrenches, and vials of viscous black oil. They stepped over iron grates where steam vented from the deep subterranean levels. The water in the artificial streams flowed continuously, pushed forward by hidden turbines, churning beneath the metal plates. The lights in the glass domes overhead shifted from the bright yellow of artificial day to the deep blue of artificial night. The Creator hung dead in his dome, and the machines he built cleaned the metal floors, sorted the scrap iron, and adjusted the pressure valves exactly as they had done when he drew breath. Deep below the city surface, behind the thick metal blast doors of the Chamber of Lorcan, the final project progressed. Huge mechanical arms moved along ceiling tracks, carrying plates of gold and brass. Factotums wielded torches and welded these plates to a massive central sphere. Sparks showered down upon the metal grating of the floor. Dark red fluid pumped through thick glass tubes, entering the top of the sphere and cycling out through the bottom. The mechanical heart expanded and contracted, pushing hot air outward with every metallic thud. The chamber walls vibrated with the rhythmic beating. Sotha Sil had set the sequence into motion, and the fabricators continued to build the new divine center, fusing metal to glass, tightening large iron bolts, and channeling energy from the geothermal vents far beneath the city crust. Inside the brass fortress, the mortal Clockwork apostles went about their daily routines. They wore heavy leather aprons over their robes and carried iron wrenches in their belts. They gathered in the brass-lined lecture halls and read aloud from thick bound books filled with Sotha Sil's diagrams and equations. They walked the suspended catwalks, wiping grease from the joints of the factotums and replacing worn cogs in the water filtration systems. They wrote out the calculations left behind by their master on long scrolls of parchment, passing the rolled texts down to the younger apprentices. The apostles ate the nutrient pasts synthesized by the city's gardens and drank the purified water. They lived, worked, and aged within the metal walls, maintaining the enormous machine generation after generation with their own hands. Far above the Clockwork City, on the ash-covered surface of Morrowind, the Dunmer laid down bricks and mortar to build the new temple. Priests in grey robes chiseled the face of Sotha Sil into blocks of volcanic stone. They placed these stone statues in the alcoves of their fresh sanctuaries. Worshippers walked into the stone halls, carrying brass cogs and bundles of bittergreen. They lit sticks of incense and laid the physical offerings at the base of the statues. The priests dipped their quills in ink and wrote his titles across the pages of their holy texts. They inscribed the words, Light of Knowledge, Father of Mysteries, and Clockwork God, into the official records. They painted his image, holding a spinning globe, placing him among the saints in their bound books. Inside the archives of the Clockwork City, audio cylinders spun on brass spindles, playing back the recorded voice of Sotha Sil. The voice spoke of looking at a flower and seeing the broken stem, looking at a machine and seeing the rusted gear. The cylinders recorded his words describing his compulsion to take the fractured pieces of the world and weld them together. He spoke of his hands shaping the metal, fusing the joints, and tightening the screws, because he could not look away from the physical matter of the world. The needle tracked across the grooves of the cylinder, projecting his explanation that he built the city, the factotums, and the mechanical heart out of a deep attachment to the physical realm. The spinning cylinder reached its end, and the needle lifted from the copper surface. The voice stopped, leaving only the hum of the turbines and the steady clacking of the distant gears. The machines and the statues stood in their respective places, reflecting the image of the architect back to anyone who stood before them. The shape he left behind caught the light from the overhead fixtures, holding a clear reflection of the man who had built it, and paving the way to examine the final image of his long existence. Sotha Sil remained at the center of his metal dome, suspended by heavy cables and surrounded by the constant rotation of gears. He watched the cogs interlock, tracing each brass tooth as it slid into its designated groove. He observed the wider world through the exact same physical mechanics. Armies marched, emperors fell, and volcanoes erupted along predetermined tracks. He mapped the sequence of events in the physical realm, connecting every falling leaf and every striking sword to the motion that caused it. He sat in his throne of copper and wire, tracing the paths of cause and effect across the continents of Nirn. Decades after the wooden beams of old Sotha collapsed into white ash and glowing coals, he began his greatest work. He forged walls of copper and massive subterranean vaults of bronze. He grew vats of synthetic tissue and braided cords of conductive wire. He took the fragile elements of the mortal realm, the soft flesh, the brittle bone, the flammable wood, and replicated them in polished steel. He calibrated the flow of steam through his subterranean pipes. He measured the rotation of the artificial suns hanging over his metal valleys. His hands assembled rigid logic engines and complex chronometers. Alongside the massive industrial machines, his fingers shaped tiny, delicate structures. He built artificial birds with spun glass feathers and set them on brass branches to sing. He crafted copper petals and painted them vivid colors to mimic the flowers that grew by the quiet ponds of his youth. He poured water into perfectly circular canals, watching the mechanical koi swim beneath the surface. He built a heavily fortified, deeply buried vault to house the beautiful things he remembered from his childhood. The intense heat of his forges and the precise mathematics of his blueprints served his deep attachment to the physical world of mortals. The elves of Morrowind created their own physical images of the Clockwork god. The temple priests painted murals of a radiant architect carrying a lantern through a dark cavern. The dissenting tribes in the ash wastes hammered effigies of a tyrant, wrapping iron chains around the wrists of the land. The fearful citizens in the towns carved statues of a figure raising a massive bronze shield against the jagged blades of the Daedric princes. Sotha Sil sat in his control center and received all their offerings. He took their prayers, their fears, and their demands, acting as a mirror of polished glass that reflected their own carved and painted faces back at them. Even after his body went entirely cold and the cables held his lifeless form in the air, the Clockwork City continued to function. The pistons pumped oil through the underground channels. The factotums swept the brass corridors with wire brushes. The artificial suns rose and set on their strict mechanical schedule. The mechanical heart beat steadily in its sealed chamber, radiating energy through the conductive conduits of the city. Sotha Sil left his mind permanently imprinted on the architecture of his realm. The whirring of the dynamos and the clicking of the logic engines carried his legacy long after the Nerevarine walked out of the bronze gates and returned to the ash-covered surface of Morrowind. The logs in this hearth settle into the ash, sending small orange sparks drifting up into the stone chimney. The fire casts long shadows across the wooden floorboards. The wind pushes heavy snow against the thick wooden planks of the door, rattling the iron hinges. You traveled a long way across the freezing tundra, carrying your heavy pack over the jagged rocks of the mountain passes. The guards patrol the stone walls outside, pulling their fur cloaks tight against the freezing wind and scanning the dark clouds for the shapes of returning dragons. Stretch out on the wool blankets and let the heat from the hearth warm your aching muscles. The ash and brass of Morrowind lie far away from these snow-covered peaks. Close your eyes and listen to the steady crackle of the burning wood. Rest your mind and let the exhaustion drain from your limbs. Take your time in this quiet hall. When the dawn breaks over the white mountains and you finally step back out into the freezing wind, may your road lead you to warm sands.